Chapter 10, E-Stat Landing. Since Mura was in the isolation of ship's sickbay, the stripping of his cabin was a relatively simple job. But, though Rip and Dane went over it literally by inches, they found nothing unusual. In fact, nothing from Sargol except a small twig of the red wood which lay on the steward's work table, where he had been fashioning something to incorporate in one of his miniature fairy landscapes, to be imprisoned for all time in a plastibubble. Dane turned this around in his fingers. Because it was the only link with the perfumed planet, he couldn't help but feel that it had some importance. But Costi had not shown any interest in the wood, and he himself and Weeks had handled it freely before they had tasted Graff's friendship cup and had no ill effects, so it couldn't be the wood. Dane put the twig back on the work table and snapped the protecting cover over the delicate tools, never realizing until days later how very close he had been in that moment to the solution of their problem. After 2 hours of shifting every one of the steward's belongings, of crawling on hands and knees about the deck, and climbing to inspect perfectly bare walls, they had found exactly nothing. Rip sat down on the end of the denuded bunk. "There's the hydro," Frank spent a lot of time in there, "and the storeroom." He told the places off on his fingers. "The galley and the mess cabin." Those had been the extent of Mura's world. They could search the storeroom, the galley, and the mess cabin, but to interfere with the hydro would endanger their air supply. It was for that very reason that they now looked at each other in startled surprise. "The perfect place to plant something," Dane spoke first. Rip's teeth caught his underlip. The hydro. Something planted there could not be routed out unless they made a landing on a port field and had the whole section stripped. Devilish. Rip's mobile lips drew tight. But how could they do it? Dane didn't see how it could have been done either. No one but the Queen's own crew had been on board the ship during their entire stay on Sargol, except for the young Salariki. Could that cub have brought something? But he and Mura had been with the youngster every minute that he had been in the hydro. To the best of Dane's memory, the cub had touched nothing and had been there only for a few moments. That had been before the feast also. Rip got to his feet. "We can't strip the hydro in space," he pointed out the obvious quietly. Dane had the answer. "Then we've got to Earth." "You heard the warn-off. If we try it—" "What about an emergency station?" Rip stood very still, his big hands locked about the buckle of his arms belt. Then, without another word, he went out of the cabin and at a pounding pace up the ladder, bound for the captain's cabin and the records Jellicoe kept there. It was such a slim chance, but it was better than none at all. Dane shouldered into the small space in his wake to find Rip making a selection from the astrogation tapes. There were E-stats among the asteroids, points prospectors or small traders in sudden difficulties might contact for supplies or repairs. The big companies maintained their own. The patrol had several for independence. "No patrol one." Rip managed to smile. "I haven't gone space-whirly yet," was his comment. He was feeding a tape into the reader on the captain's desk. In the cage over his head, the blue Hubats squatted, watching him intently. For the first time since Dane could remember, showing no sign of resentment by weird screams or wild spitting. "Patrol, E-stat A54, the reader squeaked. Rip hit a key and the wire clicked to the next entry. "Combine E-stat." Another punch and click. "Patrol E-stat A55. Punch click. "Intersolar." This time Rip's hand did not hit the key, and the squeak continued. "Coordinates." Rip reached for a stilo and jotted down the list of figures. "Got to compare this with our present course." "But that's an IS stat," began Dane, and then he laughed as the justice of such a move struck him. They did not dare set the Queen down at any patrol station, but a company one, which would be manned only by 2 or 3 men, and not expecting any but their own people, and IS owed them help now. "There may be trouble," he said, not that he would have any regrets if there was. If the IZs were responsible for the present plight of the Queen, he would welcome trouble, the kind which would plant his fists on some sneering IZ face. "We'll see about that when we come to it." Rip went on to the control cabin with his figures. Carefully he punched the combination on the plotter and watched it be compared with the course Jellicoe had set before his collapse. "Good enough," he commented as the result flashed on. "We can make it without using too much fuel." "Make what?" That was Ollie up from the search of Costy's quarters. "Nothing." He gave his report of what he had found there, and then returned to the earlier question. "Make what?" Swiftly Dane outlined their suspicions, that the seed of the trouble lay in the hydro, and that they should clean out that section, drawing upon emergency materials at the IS E-stat. "Sounds all right, but you know what they do to pirates?" inquired the engineer apprentice. Space law came into Dane's field. He needed no prompting. "Any ship in emergency," he recited automatically, "may claim supplies from the nearest E-stat, paying for them when the voyage is completed." "That means any patrol E-stat. The companies are private property." "But," Dane pointed out triumphantly, "the law doesn't say so. There's nothing about any difference between company and patrol E-stat in the law." "He's right," Rip agreed. "That law was framed when only the patrol had such stations. Companies put them in later to save tax, remember? Legally, we're all right." "Unless the agents on duty raise a howl," Ollie amended. "Oh, don't give me that look, Rip. I'm not sounding any worn-off on this, but I just want you to be prepared to find a cruiser riding our fins and giving us the hot flash as bandits. If you want to spoil the IZs, I'm all for it. Got a stat of theirs pinpointed?" Rip pointed to the figures on the computer. "There she is. We can set down in about 5 hours ship time. How long would it take to strip the hydro and reinstall?" "How can I tell?" Ollie sounded irritable. "I can give you oxygen for quarters for about 2 hours. Depends on how fast we can move. No telling until we make a start." He started for the corridor and then added over his shoulder, "You'll have to answer a comm challenge. Thought about that?" "Why?" Rip asked. "It might be comm repairs bringing us in. They won't be expecting trouble, and we will. We'll have the advantage." But Ollie was not to be shaken out of his usual dim view of the future. "All right, so we land, blaster in hand, and take the place. And they get off one little squeak to the patrol. Well, a short life, but an interesting one. And we'll make all the video channels for sure when we go out with rockets blasting. Nothing like having a little excitement to break the dull routine of a voyage." "We aren't going to, are we?" Dane protested. "Land armed, I mean." Ollie stared at him, and Rip, to Dane's surprise, did not immediately repudiate that thought. "Sleep rods, certainly," the astrogator apprentice said after a pause. "We'll have to be prepared for the moment when they find out who we are. And you can't reset a hydro in a few minutes, not when we have to keep oxygen on for the others. If we were able to turn that off and work in suits, it'd be a quicker job. We could dump before we set down and then pile it in at once. But this way it's going to be piecework, and it all depends on the agents at the stat whether we have trouble or not." "We had better break out the suits now," Ollie added to Rip's estimate of the situation. If we set down and pile out wearing suits at once, it will build up our tale of being poor wrecked spacemen. Sleep rods or not, Dane thought to himself, the whole plan was one born of desperation. It would depend on who manned the Eastat and how fast the free traders could move once the Queen touched her fins to Earth. Knock out their comms. That was Ollie continuing to plan. Do that first, and then we don't have to worry about someone calling in the patrol. Rip stretched. For the first time in hours, he seemed to have returned to his usual placid self. Good thing somebody in this spacer watches video serials. Ollie, you can brief us on all the latest tricks of the space pirates. Nothing is so wildly improbable that you can't make use of it sometime during a checkered career. He glanced over the board before he brought his hand down on a single key, set a distance apart from the other controls. Put some local color into it, was his comment. Dane understood. Rip had turned on the distress signal at the Queen's nose. When she set down on the stat field, she would be flaming in a banner of trouble. Next to the wan deadlights, set only when a ship had no hope of ever reaching port at all, that signal was one every spacer dreaded having to flash. But it was not the deadlights. Not yet for the Queen. Working together, they brought out the spacesuits and readied them at the hatch. Then Weeks and Dane took up the task of tending their unconscious charges while Rip and Ollie prepared for landing. There was no change in the sleepers. And in Jellicoe's cabin, even Queeks appeared to be influenced by the plight of its master. For instead of greeting Dane with its normal aspect of rage, the Hoobat stayed quiescent on the floor of its cage, its top claws hooked about two of the wires, its protruding eyes staring out into the room with what seemed close to a malignant intelligence. It did not even spit as Dane passed under its abode to pour thin soup into his patient. As for Sinbad, the cat had retreated to Dane's cabin and steadily refused to leave the quarters he had chosen, resisting with tooth and claw the one time Dane had tried to take him back to Van Ryck's office and his own hammock there. Afterwards, the cargo apprentice did not try to evict him. There was comfort in seeing that plump gray body curled on the bunk he had little chance to use. His nursing duties performed for the moment, Dane ventured into the hydro. He was practiced in tending this vital heart of the ship's air supply. But outfitting a hydro was something else again. In his cadet years, he had aided in such a program at least twice as a matter of learning the basic training of the service. But then they had had unlimited supplies to draw on, and the action had taken place under no more pressure than that exerted by the instructors. Now it was going to be a far more tricky job. He went slowly down the aisle between the banks of green things. Plants from all over the galaxy, grown for their contribution to the air renewal, as well as side products such as fresh fruit and vegetables, were banked there. The sweet odor of their verdant life was strong. But how could any of the four now on duty tell what was rightfully there and what might have been brought in? And could they be sure anything had been introduced? Dane stood there, his eyes searching those lines of greens, such a mixture of greens, from the familiar shade of terrace fields to greens tinged with shades first bestowed by other suns on other worlds, looking for one which was alien enough to be noticeable. Only Mura, who knew his garden as he knew his own cabin, could have differentiated between them. They would just dump everything and trust to luck. He was suddenly aware of a slight movement in the banks, a shivering of stem, quiver of leaf. The mere fact of his passing had set some sensitive plant to register his presence. A lacy, fern-like thing was contracting its fronds into balls. He should not stay, disturbing the peace of the hydro. But it made little difference now. Within a matter of hours, all this luxuriance would be thrust out to die, and they would have to depend upon canned oxygen and algae tanks. Too bad. The hydro represented much time and labor on Mura's part, and Tau had medical plants growing there he had been observing for a long time. As Dane closed the door behind him, seeing the line of bald fern which had marked his passage, he heard a faint rustling, a sound as if a wind had swept across the green room within. The imagination, which was a trader's asset, when it was kept within bounds, suggested that the plants inside guessed. With a frown for his own sentimentality, Dane strode down the corridor and climbed to check with Rip in control. The astrogator apprentice had his own problems. To bring the Queen down on the circumscribed field of an E-stat without a guide beam to ride in, since, if they contacted the stat, they must reveal their own comm was working and they would have to answer questions, was the sort of test even a seasoned pilot would tense over. Yet Rip was sitting now in the captain's place, his broad hands spread out on the edge of the control board, waiting. And below in the engine room, Ollie was in Stotz's place, ready to fire and cut rockets at order. Of course, they were both several years ahead of him in service, they knew. But he wondered at their quick assumption of responsibility, and whether he himself could ever reach that point of self-confidence, his memory turning to the bad mistake he had made on Sargol. There was the sharp note of a warning gong, the flash of red light on the control board. They were off automatic. From here on in, it was all Rip's work. Dane strapped down at the silent comm unit and was startled a moment later when it spat words at him, translated from space code. Identify, IS-E-stat calling spacer, identify. So compelling was that demand that Dane's fingers went to the answer key before he remembered and snatched them back, to fold his hands in his lap. Identify. The expressionless voice of the translator droned over their heads. Rip's hands were on the control board, playing the buttons there with the precision of a musician creating some symphonic masterpiece. And the Queen was alive, now quivering through her stout plates, coming into a landing. Dane watched the visa plate. The E-stat asteroid was of a reasonable size, but in their eyes it was a bleak, torn mote of stuff swimming through vast emptiness. Identify. The drone heightened in pitch. Rip's lips were compressed. He made quick calculations. And Dane saw that, though Jellicoe was the master, Rip was fully fit to follow in the captain's bootprints. There was a sudden silence in the cabin. The demand had stopped. The agents below must now have realized that the ship with the distress signals blazing on her nose was not going to reply. Dane found he could not watch the visa plate now. Rip's hands about their task filled his whole range of sight. He knew that Shannon was using every bit of his skill and knowledge to jockey them into position where they could ride their tail rockets down to the scorched rock of the E-stat field. Perhaps it wasn't as smooth a landing as Jellicoe could have made, but they did it. Rip's hands were quiet. Again that patch of darkness showed on the back of his tunic. He made no move from his seat. "Secure," Ollie's voice floated up to them. Dane unbuckled his safety webbing and got up, looking to Shannon for orders. This was Rip's plan they were to carry through. Then something moved him to give honor where it was due. He touched that bowed shoulder before him. "Fin landing, brother. 4 points and down." Rip glanced up. A grin made him look his old self. "Ought to have a recording of that for the board when I go up for my pass-through." Dane matched his smile. "Too bad we didn't have someone out there with a Tri-D machine." "More likely it'd be evidence at our trial for piracy." Their words must have reached Ollie on the ship's intercom, for his deflating reply came back to remind them of why they had made that particular landing. Do we move now?" "Check first," Rip said into the mic. Dane looked at the visa plate. Against a background of jagged rock teeth was the bubble of the Estat housing, more than 3/4 of it being in the hollowed-out sections below the surface of the miniature world which supported it, as Dane knew. But a beam of light shone from the dome to center on the grounded Queen. They had not caught the stat agents napping. They made the rounds of the spacer, checking on each of the semi-conscious men. Ollie had ready the artificial oxygen tanks. They must move fast once they began the actual task of clearing and restocking the hydro. "Hope you have a good story ready," he commented as the other 3 joined him by the hatch to don the suits which would enable them to cross the airless, heatless surface of the asteroid. "We have a poisoned hydro," Dane said. "One look at the plants we dump will give you the lie. They won't accept our story without investigation." Dane was aroused. Did Ollie think he was as stupid as all that? "If you take a look in there now, you'd believe me," he snapped. "What did you do?" Ollie sounded genuinely interested. "Chucked a heated can of lac oil over a good section. It's wilting down fast in big patches." Rip snorted. "Good old lac oil. You drink it, you wash in it, and now you kill off the hydro with it. Maybe we can give the company an extra testimonial for the official jabber and collect when we hit Terra." "All right. Weeks." He spoke to the little man. "You listen in on the comm. It's tuned to our helmet units. We'll climb into these pipe suits and see how many tears we can wring out of the Izies with our sad, sad tale." They got into the awkward, bulky suits and squeezed into the hatch, while Weeks slammed the lock door at their backs and operated the outer opening. Then they were looking out across the ground, still showing signs of the heat of their landing, and lighted by the dome beam. "Nobody hurrying out with an aid and comfort kit." Rip's voice sounded in Dane's earphones. "A little slack, aren't they?" Slack? Or was it that the Izies had recognized the Queen and was preparing the sort of welcome the remnant of her crew could not withstand? Dane, wanting very much in his heart to be elsewhere, climbed down the ladder in Rip's wake, both of them spotlighted by the immovable beam from the stat dome. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. Desperate Measures. Measured in distance and time, that rough walk in the ponderous suits across the broken terrain of the asteroid was a short one. Measured by the beating of his own heart, Dane thought it much too long. There was no sign of life by the airlock of the bubble, no move on the part of the men stationed there to come to their assistance. "Do you suppose we're invisible?" Ollie's disembodied voice clicked in the helmet earphones. "Maybe we'll wish we were." Dane could not forego that return. Rip was almost to the airlock door now. His massively suited arm was outstretched toward the control bar when the comm unit in all 3 helmets caught the same demand. "Identify!" The crisp order had enough snap to warn them that an answer was the best policy. "Shannon, AA of the Pole Star." Rip gave the required information. "We claim E-rights." But would they get them, Dane wondered. There was a click loud in his ears. The metal door was yielding to Rip's hand. At least those on the inside had taken off the lock. Dane quickened pace to join his leader. Together, the 3 from the Queen crowded through the locked door, saw that swing shut and seal behind them, as they stood waiting for the moment they could discard the suits and enter the dome. The odds against them could not be too high. This was a small stat. It would not house more than 4 agents at most, and they were familiar enough with the basic architecture of such stations to know just what move to make. Ollie was to go to the comm room, where he could take over if they did meet with trouble. Dane and Rip would have to handle any dissenters in the main section. But they still hoped that luck might ride their fins, and they could put over a story which would keep them out of active conflict with the Izies. The gauge on the wall registered safety, and they unfastened the protective clasps of the suits. Standing the cumbersome things against the wall as the inner door to the lock rolled back, they walked into Izie territory. As free traders, they had the advantage of being uniformly tunicked, with no company badge to betray their ship or status. So that could well be the Pole Star standing needle-slim behind them, and not the notorious Solar Queen. But each, as he passed through the inner lock, gave a hitch to his belt which brought the butt of his sleep rod closer to hand. Innocuous as that weapon was, in close quarters its effects, if only temporary, was to some purpose. And since they were prepared for trouble, they might have a slight edge over the Izies in attack. A company man, his tunic shabby and open in a negligent fashion at his thick throat, stood waiting for them. His unhelmeted head was grizzled, his coarse, tanned face with heavy jowls bristly enough to suggest he had not bothered to use smooth cream for some days. An under-officer of some spacer, retired to finish out the few years before pension in his nominal duty, fast letting down the standards of personal regime he had had to maintain on shipboard. But he wasn't all fat and soft living. The glance with which he measured them was shrewdly appraising. "What's your trouble?" he demanded without greeting. "You didn't ident coming in." "Comms are out," Rip replied as shortly. "We need E-hydro." "First time I ever heard it that the comms were wired in with the grass." The Izie's hands were on his hips, in close proximity to something which made Dane's eyes narrow. The fellow was wearing a flare blaster. That might be regulation equipment for an E-stat agent on a lonely asteroid, but he didn't quite believe it. And probably the other was quick on the draw, too. "The comms are something else," Rip answered readily. "Our tech is working on them, but the hydro's bad all through. We'll need to dump and restock. Give you a voucher on tariff for the stuff." The icy agent continued to block the doorway into the station. "This is private, IS property. You should hit the patrol post. They cater to UFTs. We hit the nearest E-stat when we discovered that we were contaminated." Rip spoke with an assumption of patience. "That's the law, and you know it. You have to supply us and take a voucher." "How do I know that your voucher's worth the film it's recorded on?" asked the agent reasonably. "All right," Rip shrugged. "If we have to do it the hard way, we'll cargo dump to cover your bill." "Not on this field." The other shook his head. "I'll flash in your voucher first." He had them, Dane thought bitterly. Their luck had run out. Because what he was going to do was a move they dared not protest. It was one any canny agent would make in the present situation. And if they were what they say they were, they must readily agree to let him flash their voucher of payment to IS headquarters, to be checked and okayed before they took the hydro stock. But Rip merely registered a mild resignation. "You the Comtech? Where's your unit? I'll indit it at once if you want it that way." Whether their readiness to cooperate allayed some of the agent's suspicion or not, he relaxed some, giving them one more stare all around before he turned on his heel. "This way." They followed him down the narrow hall, Rip on his heels, the others behind. "Lonely post," Rip commented. "I'd think you boys would get space-whirly out here." The others snorted. "We're not star lovers, and the pay's worth a 3-month stretch. They take us down for terra leave before we start talking to the Whisperers." "How many of you here at one time?" Rip edged the question in casually. but the other might have been expecting it by the way he avoided giving a direct answer. "Enough to run the place, and not enough to help you clean out your wagon." He was short about it. "Any dumping you do is strictly on your own. You've enough hands on a spacer that size to manage." Rip laughed. "Far be it from me to ask an Izzy to do any real work," was his counter. "We know all about you company men." But the agent did not take fire at that jib. Instead, he pushed back a panel, and they were looking into comm unit room, where another man in the tunic of the IS lounged on what was by law 24-hour duty, divided into 3 watches. "These FTs want to flash a voucher request through," their guide informed the tech. The other, interested, gave them a searching once-over before he pushed a small scriber toward Rip. "It's all yours, clear ether," he reported. Ollie stood with his back to the wall, and Dane still lingered in the portal. Both of them fixed their attention on Rip's left hand. If he gave the agreed-upon signal... Their fingers were linked loosely in their belts, only an inch or so from their sleep rods. With his right hand, Rip scooped up the scribbler while the comtech half-turned to make adjustments to the controls, picking up a speaker to call the IS headquarters. Rip's left index finger snapped across his thumb to form a circle. Ollie's rod did not even leave his belt. It tilted up, and the invisible deadening stream from it centered upon the seated tech. At the same instant, Dane shot at the agent who had guided them there. The latter had time for a surprised grunt, and his hand was at his blaster as he sagged to his knees and then relaxed on the floor. The tech slumped across the callboard as if sleep had overtaken him at his post. Rip crossed the room and snapped off the switch which opened the wire for broadcasting, while Ollie, with Dane's help, quietly and effectively immobilized the Izzies with their own belts. "There should be at least 3 men here." Rip waited by the door. "We have to get them all under control before we start work." However, the interior of the bubble, extending as it did on levels beneath the outer crust of the asteroid, was not an easy place to search. An enemy, warned of the invasion, could easily keep ahead of the party from the Queen, spying on them at his leisure or preparing traps for them. In the end, afraid of wasting time, they contented themselves with locking the doors of the corridor leading to the lower levels, making ready to raid the storeroom they had discovered during their search. Emergency hydro supplies consisted mainly of algae, which could be stored in tanks and hastily put to use, as the plants now in the Queen took much longer to grow, even under forcing methods. Dane volunteered to remain inside the E-Stat and assemble the necessary containers at the airlock, while the other 2, having had more experience, went back to the spacer to strip the hydro and prepare to switch contents. But when Rip and Ollie left, the younger cargo apprentice began to find the bubble a haunted place. He took the sealed containers out of their storage racks, stood them on a small hand truck, and pushed them to the foot of the stairs, up which he then climbed, carrying 2 of the cylinders at a time. The swish of the air current through the narrow corridors made a constant murmur of sound, but he found himself listening for something else, for a footfall other than his own, for the betraying rasp of clothing against a wall, for even a whisper of voice. And time again he paused suddenly to listen, sure that the faintest hint of such a sound had reached his ears. He had a dozen containers lined up when the welcome signal reached him by the comm unit of his field helmet. To transfer the cylinders to the lock, get out, and then open the outer door did not take long. But as he waited, he still listened for a sound which did not come. The notice that someone besides himself was free to move about the stat. Not knowing just how many of the supply tins were needed, he worked on transferring all there were in the storage racks to the upper corridor and the lock. But he still had half a dozen left to pass through when Rip sent a message that he was coming in. Out of his pressure suit, the astrogator apprentice stepped lightly into the corridor, looking at the array of containers, and shook his head. "We don't need all those. No, leave them," he added as Dane, with a sigh, started to pick up two for a return trip. "There's something more important just now." He turned into the side hall which led to the comm room. Both the IS men had awakened. The comtech appeared to accept his bonds philosophically. He was quiet and flat on his back, staring pensively at the ceiling. But the other agent had made a worm's progress half across the room, and Rip had to halt in haste to prevent stepping on him. Shannon stooped and, hooking his fingers in the other's tunic, heaved him back while the helpless man favored them with some of the ripest speech, and not trade lingo, Dane had ever heard. Rip waited until the man began to run down, and then he broke in with his pleasant soft drawl. "Oh, sure, we're all that. But time runs on, Izzy, and I'd like a couple answers which may mean something to you. First, when do you expect your relief?" That set the agent off again, and his remarks, edited, were that no something something FT was going to get any something something information out of him. But it was his companion in misfortune, the comtech, who guessed the reason behind Rip's question. "Cut jets," he advised the other. "They're just being soft-hearted, I take it." He spoke over the other agent's sputtering to Rip. "That you're worried about leaving us finned down. That's it, isn't it?" Rip nodded. "In spite of what you think about us," he replied, "we're not patrol-posted outlaws." "No, you're just from a plague ship," the comtech remarked calmly, and his words struck his comrade dumb. "Solar Queen?" "You got the warrant off, then." "Who didn't? You really have plague on board?" The thought did not appear to alarm the comtech unduly. But his fellow suddenly heaved his bound body some distance away from the free traders, and his face displayed mixed emotions, most of them fearful. "We have something, probably supplied," Rip straightened. "Might pass along to your bosses that we know that. Suppose you tell me about your relief. When is it due?" "Not until after we take off on the long orbit, if you leave us like this. On the other hand," the other added coolly, "I don't see how you can do otherwise. We've still got those—" With his chin he pointed to the comm unit. "After a few alterations," Rip amended. The bulk of the comm was in a tightly sealed case which they would need a flamer to open. But he could, and did, wreak havoc with the exposed portions. The tech watching this destruction spouted at least two expressions his companion had not used, but when Rip finished, he was his unruffled self again. "Now," Rip drew his sleep rod, "a little rest, and when you wake it will be all a bad dream." He carefully beamed each man into slumber and helped Dane strip off their bonds. But before he left the room, he placed on the recorder the voucher for the supplies they had taken. The Queen was not stealing. Under the law, she still had some shadow of rights. Suited, they crossed the rough rock to the ship, and there about the fins, already frozen into brittle spikes, was a tangle of plants, the rich result of years of collecting. "Did you find anything?" Dane asked as they rounded that mess on their way to the ladder. Rip's voice came back through the helmet comm. "Nothing we know how to interpret. I wish Frank or Craig had had a chance to check. We took tri-Ds of everything before we dumped. Maybe they can learn something from these when—" His voice trailed off, leaving that when to ring in both their minds. It was such an important when. When would either the steward or the medic recover enough to view those tri-D shots? Or was that when really an ominous if? Back in the Queen, sealed once more for blastoff, they took their stations. Dane speculated as to the course Rip had set, Were they just going to wander about the system, hoping to escape notice until they had somehow solved their problem? Or did Shannon have some definite port in mind? He did not have time to ask before they lifted, but once they were spaceborne again, he voiced his question. Rip's face was serious. "Frankly," he began, and then hesitated for a long moment before he added, "I don't know. If we can only get the captain or Craig on their feet again." "One thing," Ollie materialized to join them, "Sinbad's back in the hydro, and this morning you couldn't get him inside the door. It's not a very good piece of evidence." No, it wasn't, but they clung to it as backing for their actions of the past few hours. The cat that had shown such a marked distaste for the company of the stricken, and then for the hydro, was now content to visit the latter as if some evil he has sensed there had been cleansed with the dumping of the garden. They had not yet solved their mystery, but another clue had come into their hands. But now the care of the sick occupied hours, and Rip insisted that a watch be maintained by the comm, listening in for news which might concern the Queen. They had done a good job at silencing the Estat, for they had been almost 6 hours in space before the news of their raid was beamed to the nearest patrol post. Ollie laughed. "Told you we'd be pirates," he said, when he listened to that account of their descent upon the IS station. "Though I didn't see all that blaster work they're now raving about. You'd think we fought a major battle there." Weeks growled. "The Izies are trying to make it look good, make us into outlaws." But Rip did not share in the general amusement at the wild extravagation of the report from the ether. "I noticed they didn't say anything about the voucher we left." Ollie's cynical smile curled. "Did you expect them to? The Izies think they have us by the tail fins now. Why should they give us any benefit of the doubt?" "We junked all our boosters behind us on this takeoff, and don't forget that, my friends." Weeks looked confused. "But I thought you said we could do this legal." He appealed to Rip. "If we're patrol-posted as outlaws—" "They can't do any more to us than they can for running in a plague ship," Ollie pointed out. "Either will get us blasted if we happen into the wrong vector now. So, what do we do?" "We find out what the plague really is," Dane said, and meant every word of it. "How?" Ollie inquired. "Through some of Craig's magic?" Dane was forced to answer with the truth. "I don't know yet, but it's our only chance." Rip rubbed his eyes wearily. "Don't think I'm disagreeing, but just where do we start? We've already combed Frank's quarters and Costy's. We cleaned out the hydro." "Those tri-D shots of the hydro, have you checked them yet?" Dane countered. Without a word, Ollie arose and left the cabin. He came back with a microfilm roll. Fitting it into the large projector, he focused it on the wall and snapped the button. They were looking at the hydro, down the length of space so accurately recorded that it seemed they might walk straight into it. The greenery of the plants was so vivid and alive, Dane felt that he could reach out and pluck a leaf. Inch by inch he examined those ranks, looking for something which was not in order, had no right to be there. The long shot of the hydro as it had been merged into a series of sectional groupings. In silence they studied it intently, using all their field lore in an attempt to spot what each one was certain must be there somewhere. But they were all handicapped by their lack of intimate knowledge of the garden. "Wait!" Weeks's voice scaled up. "Left hand, corner, there!" His pointing hand broke and shadowed the portion he was calling to their attention. Ollie jumped to the projector and made a quick adjustment. Plants 4 and 5 times life-size glowed green on the wall. What Weeks had caught they all saw now. Ragged leaves, stripped stems. "Chewed," Dane supplied the answer. It was only one species of plant which had been so mangled. Other varieties in the same bank showed no signs of disturbance. But all of that one type had at least one stripped branch, and 2 were virtual skeletons. "A pest," said Rip. "But Sinbad—" Dane began a protest before the memory of the cat's peculiar actions of the past week stopped him. Sinbad had slipped up. The hunter who had kept the Queen free of the outre alien life which came aboard from time to time with cargo had not attacked that which had ravaged the hydro plants. Or, if he had done so, he had not, after his usual custom, presented the bodies of the slain to any crew member. "It looks as if we have something at last," Ollie observed, and someone echoed that with a sigh of heart-deep relief. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Strange Behavior of a Hubbat. "All right, so we think we know a little more," Ollie added a moment later. "Just what are we going to do? We can't stay in space forever. They're the small items of fuel and supplies and—" Rip had come to a decision. "We're not going to remain spaceborne," he stated with the confidence of one who now saw an open road before him. "Luna?" Weeks was plainly doubtful. "No, not after that Warnoff. Terra." For a second or two, the other 3 stared at Rip agape. The audacity and danger of what he suggested was a little stunning. Since men had taken regularly to space, no ship had made a direct landing on their home planet. All had passed through the quarantine on Luna. It was not only risky, it was so unheard of that for some minutes they did not understand him. "We try to set down at Terraport," Dane found his tongue first, "and they flame us out." Rip was smiling. "The trouble with you," he addressed them all, "is that you think of Earth only in terms of Terraport." "Well, there is the patrol field at Stella," Weeks agreed doubtfully, "but we'd be right in the middle of trouble there." "Did we have a regular port on Sargol, on Limbo, on 50 others I can name out of our log?" Rip wanted to know. Ollie voiced a new objection. "So, we have the luck of Jones and we set down somewhere out of sight. Then what do we do?" "We seal the ship until we find the pest. Then we bring in a medic and get to the bottom of the whole thing." Rip's confidence was contagious. Dane almost believed that it could be done that way. "Did you ever think," Ollie cut in, "what would happen if we were wrong? If the Queen really is a plague carrier?" "I said we seal the ship. Tight," countered Shannon. "And when we Earth, it'll be where we won't have visitors to infect." "And that is where?" Ollie, who knew the deserts of Mars better than he did the greener planet from which his stock had sprung, pursued the question. "Right in the middle of the Big Burn." Dane, Terra-born and bred, realized first what Rip was planning and what it meant. Sealed off was right. The Queen would be amply protected from investigation. Whether her crew would survive was another matter. Whether she could even make a landing there was also to be considered. The Big Burn was the horrible scar left by the last of the atomic wars, a section of radiation-poisoned land comprising hundreds of square miles, land which generations had never dared to penetrate. Originally, the survivors of that war had shunned the whole continent which it disfigured. It had been close to 2 centuries before men had gone into the still wholesome land laying to the far west and the south. And through the years, the avoidance of the Big Burn had become part of their racial instinct as they shrank from it. It was a symbol of something no Terran wanted to remember. But Ollie now had only one question to ask. "Can we do it?" "We'll never know until we try," was Rip's reply. "The patrol will be watching." That was Weeks. With his Venusian background, he had less respect for the dangers of the Big Burn than he did for the forces of law and order which ranged the star lanes. "They'll be watching the route lanes," Rip pointed out. "They won't expect a ship to come in on that vector, steering away from the ports. Why should they? As far as I know, it's never been tried since Terraport was laid out. It'll be tricky. And he himself would have to bear most of the responsibility for it. But I believe that it can be done. We can't just roam around out here. With IS out for our blood and a patrol worn off, it won't do us any good to head for Luna." None of his listeners could argue with that. And Dane's spirits began to rise. After all, they knew so little about the Big Burn. It might afford them just the temporary sanctuary they needed. In the end, they agreed to try it, mainly because none of them could see any alternative, except the too dangerous one of trying to contact the authorities and being summarily treated as a plague ship before they could defend themselves. And their decision was ably endorsed not long afterwards by a sardonic warning on the comm, a warning which Ollie, who had been tending the machine, passed along to them. "Greetings, pirates." "What do you mean?" Dane was heating broth to feed to Captain Jellicoe. "The word has gone out. Our raid on the Eastat is now a matter of history and patrol record. We've been posted." Dane felt a cold finger drawn along his backbone. Now they were fair game for the whole system. Any patrol ship that wanted could shoot them down with no questions asked. Of course, that had always been a possibility from the first after their raid on the Eastat. But to realize that it was now true was a different matter altogether. This was one occasion when realization was worse than anticipation. He tried to keep his voice level as he answered. "Let's hope we can pull off Rip's plan." "We'd better. What about the Big Burn anyway, Thorson? Is it as tough as the stories say?" "We don't know what it's like. It's never been explored, or at least those who tried to explore its interior never reported in afterwards. As far as I know, it's left strictly alone." "Is it still all hot?" "Parts of it must be, but all we don't know." With the bottle of soup in his hand, Dane climbed to Jellicoe's cabin. And he was so occupied with the problem at hand that at first he did not see what was happening in the small room. He had braced the captain up into a half-sitting position, and was patiently ladling the liquid into his mouth a spoonful at a time, when a thin squeak drew his attention to the top of Jellicoe's desk. From the half-open lid of a microtape compartment, something long and dark projected, beating the air feebly. Dane, easing the captain back on the bunk, was going to investigate, when the Hoobat broke its unnatural quiet of the past few days with an ear-splitting screech of fury. Dane struck at the bottom of its cage, the move its master always used to silence it, but this time the results were spectacular. The cage bounced up and down on the spring which secured it to the ceiling of the cabin, and the blue-feathered horror slammed against the wires. Either its clawing had weakened them, or some fault had developed, for they parted and the Hoobat came through them to land with a sullen plop on the desk. Its screams stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and it scuttled on its spider-toed legs to the microtape compartment, acting with purposeful dispatch and paying no attention to Dane. Its claws shot out, and with ease it extracted from the compartment a creature as weird as itself, one which came fighting and of which Dane could not get a very clear idea. Struggling, they battled across the surface of the desk and flopped to the floor. There the hunted broke loose from the hunter and fled with fantastic speed into the corridor. And before Dane could move, the Hoobat was after it. He gained the passage just in time to see Queeks disappear down the ladder, clinging with the aid of its pincher claws, apparently grimly determined to catch up with the thing it pursued. And Dane went after them. There was no sign of the creature, who fled on the next level. But Dane made no move to recapture the blue hunter who squatted at the foot of the ladder, staring unblinkingly into space. Dane waited, afraid to disturb the Hoobat. He had not had a good look at the thing which had run from Queeks, but he knew it was something which had no business aboard the Queen. And it might be the disturbing factor they were searching for. If the Hoobat would only lead 'em to it. The Hoobat moved, rearing up on the tips of its 6 legs, its neckless head slowly revolving on its puffy shoulders. Along the ridge of its backbone, its blue feathers were rising into a crest, much as Sinbad's fur rose when the cat was afraid or angry. Then, without any sign of haste, it crawled over and began descending the ladder once more, heading toward the lower section, which housed the hydro. Dane remained where he was until it had almost reached the deck of the next level, and then he followed, one step at a time. He was sure that the Hoobat's peculiar construction of body prevented it from looking up, unless it turned upon its back, but he did not want to do anything which would alarm it, or deter Queeks from what he was sure was a methodical chase. Queeks stopped again at the foot of the second descent, and sat in its toad stance, apparently brooding, a round blue blot. Dane clung to the ladder and prayed that no one would happen along to frighten it. Then, just as he was beginning to wonder if it had lost contact with its prey, once more it arose, and with the same speed it had displayed in the captain's cabin, it shot along the corridor to the hydro. To Dane's knowledge, the door of the garden was not only shut, but sealed, and how either the stranger or Queeks could get through it he did not see. "What the—" Ollie clattered down the ladder to halt abruptly as Dane waved at him. "Queeks," the cargo apprentice kept his voice to a half-whisper. "It got loose and chased something out of the old man's cabin down here." "Queeks?" Ollie began, then shut his mouth, moving noiselessly up to join Dane. The short corridor ended at the hydro entrance, and Dane had been right. There they found the Hoobat, crouched at the closed panel, its claws clicking against the metal as it picked away useless at the portal which would not admit it. "Whatever it's after must be in there," Dane said softly. And the hydro, stripped of its luxuriance of plant life, occupied now by the tanks of green scum, would not afford too many hiding places. They had only to let Queeks in and keep watch. As they came up, the Hoobat flattened to the floor and shrilled its war cry, spitting at their boots and then flashing claws against the stout, metal-enforced hide. However, though it was prepared to fight them, it showed no signs of wishing to retreat, and for that Dane was thankful. He quickly pressed the release and tugged open the panel. At the first crack of its opening, Queeks turned with one of those bursts of astounding speed and clawed for admittance, its protest against the men forgotten. And it squeezed through a space Dane would have thought too narrow to accommodate its bloated body. Both men slipped around the door behind it and closed the panel tight. The air was not as fresh as it had been when the plants were there, and the vats which had taken the places of the banked greenery were certainly nothing to look at. Queeks humped itself into a clod of blue, immovable, halfway down the aisle. Dane tried to subdue his breathing to listen. The Hoobat's action certainly argued that the alien thing had taken refuge here, though how it had gotten through— but if it were in the hydro, it was well hidden. He had just begun to wonder how long they must wait when Queeks again went into action. Its clawed front legs upraised, it brought the pinchers deliberately together and sawed one across the other, producing a rasping sound which was almost a vibration in the air. Back and forth moved the claws. Watching them produced almost a hypnotic effect, and the reason for such a maneuver was totally beyond the human watchers. But Queeks knew what it was doing all right. Ollie's fingers closed on Dane's arm, in a pincher grip as painful as if he had been equipped with the horny armament of the Hubbat. Something, a flitting shadow, had rounded one vat and was that much closer to the industrious fiddler on the floor. By some weird magic of its own, the Hubbat was calling its prey to it. Scrape, scrape. The unmusical performance continued with monotonous regularity. Again the shadow flashed, one vat closer. The Hubbat now presented the appearance of one charmed by its own art, sunk in a lethargy of weird music-making. At last the enchanted came into full view, though lingering at the round side of a container, very apparently longing to flee again, but under some compulsion to approach its enchanter. Dane blinked, not quite sure that his eyes were not playing tricks on him. He had seen the almost transparent globe bogies of Limbo, had been fascinated by the weird and ugly pictures in Captain Jellicoe's collection of 3D prints. But this creature was as impossible in its way as the horrific blue thing dragging it out of concealment. It walked erect on 2 threads of legs, with 4 knobby joints easily detected. A bulging abdomen sheathed in the horny substance of a beetle shell ended in a sharp point. 2 pairs of small legs, folded close to the much smaller upper portion of its body, were equipped with thorn-shack terminations. The head, which constantly turned back and forth on the armor-plated shoulders, was long and narrow, and split for half its length by a mouth above which were deep pits which must harbor eyes, though actual organs were not visible to the watching men. It was a palish gray in color, which surprised Dane a little. His memory of the few seconds he had seen it on the captain's desk had suggested that it was much darker. And erect as it was, it stood about 18 inches high. With head turning rapidly, it still hesitated by the side of the vat, so nearly the color of the metal that unless it moved it was difficult to distinguish. As far as Dane could see, the Hubbat was paying it no attention. Queeks might be lost in a happy dream, the result of its own fiddling. Nor did the rhythm of that scraping vary. The nightmare thing made the last foot in a rush of speed which reduced it to a blur, coming to a halt before the Hubbat. Its front legs whipped out to strike at its enemy. But Queeks was no longer dreaming. This was the moment the Hubbat had been awaiting. One of the sawing claws opened and closed, separating the head of the lurker from its body. And before either of the men could interfere, Queeks had dismembered the prey with dispatch. "Look there," Dane pointed. The Hubbat held close the body of the stranger, and where the ashy corpse came into contact with Queeks's blue-feathered skin, it was slowly changing hue, as if some of the color of its hunter had rubbed off on it. "Chameleon!" Ollie went down on one knee, the better to view the grisly feast now in progress. "Watch out," he added sharply as Dane came to join him. One of the thin upper limbs lay where Queeks had discarded it, and from the needle tip was oozing some colorless drops of fluid. Poison? Dane looked around for something which he could use to pick up the still jerking appendage, but before he could find anything, Queeks had appropriated it, and in the end they had to allow the Hubbat its victim in its entirety. But once Queeks had consumed its prey, it lapsed into its usual hunched immobility. Dane went for the cage, and working gingerly, he and Ollie got the creature back in captivity. But all the evidence now left were some smears on the floor of the hydro, smears which Ollie blotted up for future research in the lab. An hour later, the 4 who now comprised the crew of the Queen gathered in the mess for a conference. Queeks was in its cage on the table before them, asleep after all its untoward activity. "There must be more than just one," Weeks said. "But how are we going to hunt them down? With Sinbad?" Dane shook his head. Once the Hoobat had been caged and the more prominent evidence of the battle scraped from the floor, he had brought the cat into the hydro and forced him to sniff at the site of the engagement. The result was that Sinbad had gone raving mad, and Dane's hands were now covered with claw tears which ran viciously deep. It was plain that the ship's cat was having none of the intruders, alive or dead. He had fled to Dane's cabin, where he had taken refuge on the bunk, and snarled wild-eyed when anyone looked in from the corridor. "Queeks has to do it," Rip said. "But will it hunt unless it's hungry?" He surveyed the now comatose creature skeptically. They had never seen the captain's pet eat anything except some pellets which Jellicoe kept in his desk, and they were afraid that the intervals between such feedings were quite lengthy. If they had to wait the usual time for Queeks to feel hunger pangs once more, they might have to wait a long time. "We should catch one alive," Ollie remarked thoughtfully. "If we could get Queeks to fiddle it out to where we could net it—" Weeks nodded eagerly. "A small net, like those the Salariki use. Drop it over the thing." While Queeks still drowsed in its cage, Weeks went to work with fine cord. Holding the color-changing abilities of the enemy in mind, they could not tell how many of the creatures might be roaming the ship. It could only be proved where they weren't by where Sinbad would consent to stay. So they made plans which included both the cat and the Hoobat. Sinbad, much against his will, was buckled into an improvised harness by which he could be controlled without the handler losing too much valuable skin. And then the hunt started at the top of the ship, proceeding downward section by section. Sinbad raised no protest in the control cabin, nor in the private cabins of the officers thereabouts. If they could interpret his reactions, the center section was free of the invaders. So, with Dane in control of the cat, and Ollie carrying the caged Hoobat, they descended once more to the level which housed the hydro galley, steward's quarters, and ship's sick-bay. Sinbad proceeded on his own 4 feet into the galley and the mess. He was not uneasy in the sick-bay, nor in Mura's cabin, and this time he even paced the hydro without being dragged, much to their surprise, as they had thought that the headquarters of the stowaways. "Could there only have been one?" Weeks wanted to know as he stood by ready with the net in his hands. "Either that, or else we're wrong about the hydro being their main hideout. If they're afraid of Queeks now, they may have withdrawn to the place they feel the safest," Rip said. It was when they were on the ladder leading to the cargo level that Sinbad balked. He planted himself firmly and yowled against further progress, until Dane, with the harness, pulled him along. "Look at Queeks." They followed Weeks's order. The Hoobat was no longer lethargic. It was raising itself, leaning forward to clasp the bars of its cage, and now it uttered one of its screams of rage. And as Ollie went down the ladder, it rattled the bars in a determined effort for freedom. Sinbad, spitting and yowling, refused to walk. Rip nodded to Ollie. "Let it out." Tipped out of its cage, the Hoobat scuttled forward, straight for the panel which opened on the large cargo space, and there waited, as if for them to open the portal and admit the hunter to its hunting territory. End of Chapter 12.